Well, hello, and welcome to our Shriver Hangout on Air for August. My name is Amanda Moore, and I'm the Director of Online Content and Communities at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law. I'm very pleased today to have with me two guests. They are the authors of our current Clearinghouse article on the Clearinghouse community site. You can see the URL for that right below us. I have with me Jamie Price and Megan Price. Jamie's the Executive Director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute. He's also a research professor in Insight Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, and he's joining me today from New York. Hi, Jamie.
Hey, Amanda. Nice to be here.
Glad to have you. And I also have with me Megan Price. She is the director of the Insight Conflict Resolution Program, which is in the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And Megan's joining us today from DC. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And I am coming to you from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Before we jump into talking with Jamie and Megan, I want to tell you a little bit about how this Hangout works and how you can participate. A big part of hosting these Hangouts is so we can hear from you, so you can get to know our authors, some leaders in the field, and tell us, give us your questions, tell us your experience with the topic. We'd really like to have some interaction with you today. There are two ways you can do that. If you're watching us through the Google Hangout itself, if you'll hover your mouse over the left side of your screen, you'll see a little toolbar pop up, and one of those icons is a blue box that says Q&A. If you click that, you'll see a chat box open up down the right side of your screen, and that's how you can send us questions or stories or comments. We would love to hear those. And if you want to go ahead and test that out right now, feel free. You can just say your name and where you're watching. We'd love to hear from you. If you are not watching through Google Hangout, I know a lot of you are watching the live stream through the Shriver Center's YouTube channel. We'd still like to hear from you, and you can use Twitter to do that. So if on Twitter you want to use this hashtag right here, Shriver Hangout, we will get your tweets, and I can pass those questions along to our speakers as well. Or you can tweet to us at Shriver Center. Go ahead, you can also test that channel out right now as well. I'd like to go ahead and start talking now with Jamie and Megan about their article. Their article is called Insight Policing and the Role of the Civilian in Police Accountability. And as I'm sure all our guests know, it's a really timely topic. We're a year out now from Michael Brown's death last year in Ferguson, Missouri, and I think in the past year, we've really had more mainstream attention on police-civilian relations than, I can remember really since back to, the early 90s and Rodney King. And this is something, it's not just in the activist community, it's not just in communities that are affected particularly by police interactions. It's become really a mainstream conversation. So their article is really fascinating to me because it's about an approach to policing to really try to stop some of these cycles of conflict that occur between police and civilians, and then between civilians when police are not part of the equation because they can't be trusted or they have no real legitimacy in the eyes of the community members. So I want to jump in and talk to them first. I do see we have some people who've joined us. Hi, Zach in Chicago and Pat in St. Louis. Thanks for joining us. I hope we'll hear from you later if you have any questions for Jamie and Megan or any of your own experiences to share. Megan, I'd like to start with you. Can you just explain to us what this concept is, this idea of insight policing?
Sure. Well, insight policing is a community-oriented problem-solving approach to policing that gives officers a framework and the skills to recognize, understand, and ultimately disengage conflict behavior that they encounter in their interactions with community members.
Well, thanks. And Jamie, can you tell us about how that works? It's a nice idea. How does it work in reality?
Well, just to build on what Megan was saying, the quick answer is that insight policing works by helping officers to distinguish that fine line between criminal behavior and conflict behavior. And it gives them a set, as Megan said, it gives them a set of practical conflict resolution tools to go along with their law enforcement skills. And the result of that is that it balances the officer's ability to deal with civilians and deal with situations so that it isn't always in an enforcement mode. It's a peacemaking, conflict resolving mode as well, which enhances their legitimacy. And our finding is that inside policing works, and that inside policing skills not only help police departments and police officers understand and prevent retaliatory crime, particularly violent crime, which are rooted in conflict, but also enhances their legitimacy, as you were saying in your opening remarks, enhances the legitimacy of the authority of police officers when they're carrying out their routine duties. And this is because whether they like it or not, whether they intend it or not, just being a police officer generates a threat in the community member with whom they encounter. You don't want to get a ticket. You're wondering what's up. The authority of the police officers is unquestioned, and so conflict behavior, and we can talk about this more later, but conflict behavior really comes when somebody feels something is threatened, something important to them is threatened, and they decide to protect it. They may decide to protect it by running, they may decide to protect it by getting angry, they may decide. And if an officer can recognize that those behaviors of civilians as conflict, as opposed to proto-criminal behavior, or to see it as through a differentiated lens that includes conflict and crime as ways of understanding things, it enhances their legitimacy significantly because civilians feel heard and responded to and respected in ways that they then enable them to step up and cooperate in ways that they might not if they were just feeling in a conflict relationship with the officer.
Right. I know one thing in your article that I thought was interesting was you described 4 types, I believe, of conflict behavior. Some things that I think I would not have thought of as conflict. One being a freeze type of behavior where you just don't interact. That in itself is a conflict behavior in a way.
Yeah, and the reason, I mean, the types that we talked about in the article will all begin with, everybody knows the fight or flight type approach, and you either fight or you run away, but also freezing in the sense of trying to camouflage yourself, become invisible. And then there's also fawning, which is the effort to say, hey, I'm not a threat to you. You don't have to worry about me. And officers are taught to, and civilians too, for that matter, are taught to recognize those kinds of behavior and to know that it isn't just behavior on the outside, but to recognize that if somebody is behaving like that, 2 things are going on. One, they have a sense of threat about something, they don't know what at this point, and 2, they've decided to take this approach to protecting whatever that is. And the problem with conflict behavior is people who are feeling threatened and deciding to protect themselves are, 1, pretty certain that they know they're threatened, and 2, pretty righteous about protecting themselves. They're not curious, they're not open to rethinking the situation. They're just focused on protection, and that poses a lot of problems for officers and for anybody in the situation. So we teach officers to work with that and to open it up and to stop there.
Okay. Well, we have a question that's come in from Pat in St. Louis. Pat, I see your question. I'm going to hold it for just a minute until I think we're going to get to your idea later in the conversation. I want to sort of establish some more of the basics about insight policing first, and Jamie and Megan's work. Your article discusses work that you have done with police departments in Memphis, Tennessee, and in Lowell, Massachusetts. And to me, that was really a fascinating part of your article, because it's one thing to have this theory and it's another to put it into practice. And you really saw some results. Megan, what were some of the results you saw in your work with those police departments?
Well, there were a number of results, and two, I guess, stand out for me. And first, it was this collaborative part. It was insight policing, which was the result of a collaborative partnership with these departments. We were asked by the Department of Justice to use conflict resolution theory to address the problem of retaliatory violence. And we could have come in with an answer already. But we went into these departments and we actually got curious about, well, what is it about retaliatory violence that presents a challenge that that is most concerning to you, to your officers, and to the communities. And what we found was that it really did boil down to community cooperation with police and this sense of legitimacy. So we made that the centerpiece of insight policing, and what became insight policing, bringing insight conflict resolution skills to police skills. So that was the first kind of major result or outcome of our partnerships. And then it turned out that after we trained a number of officers in both cities, that it really did make a difference in how officers were engaging with the public. So in the article, there are a number of examples, but rather than beginning in a defensive mode, which often happens because officers are trained, I mean, they're keen, they're trained to recognize threat, and to try to prevent it. But learning to recognize conflict behavior and to become curious about that kind of changed the orientation of the officers that we trained, and it made a difference in their own experience of doing their jobs, and in the experiences of the community members who became more cooperative, who complied in ways that that actually really surprised the officers. So.
Well, we have a question that just came in from Zach, and he asks, how much resistance did you meet in trying to work with the police departments? He notes that other researchers have found it difficult to conduct accurate research and get cooperation. And then he's saying if it worked well, if you didn't have much research resistance, why do you think that was?
That's an interesting question, and I can take it, or maybe we both can, Jamie. There was, in beginning to work with the departments, there was some resistance, but not a lot, because we really came into both of the departments curious and wondering, and not trying to say, we have the answer here, you need to know these things, and then your problems will be solved. But we said, well, what are your challenges? And how can we help, and how can we do this together? And so beginning that way opened, basically delinked any kind of threat that the police department might have about us as outside academic researchers, that kind of thing. So we were really welcomed by both Lowell and Memphis police departments. And then in the trainings themselves, there were, the first, at the beginning, there were some crossed arms, we're not conflict resolutionists, like we don't want to do this, we're police officers, we're here to get the bad guys, that kind of thing. But that quickly changed when we started to talk about how the insight approach is a matter of paying attention to what we all do, which is use our minds, and what we're doing when we're using our minds to make decisions that get us in conflict. So I think the content resonated with people because they could experience it in themselves. And yeah, so Jamie, did you want to add something there?
No, I think that's absolutely right. The only thing I would emphasize is that from the beginning, we were invited to come to Memphis, and we were invited to come to Lowell. We did get, I mean, the Bureau of Justice Assistance put out the RFP. We responded to it. Our proposal was awarded, and then they helped us. They went to their contacts in the policing field and said, hey, we got this demonstration project that looks promising, that we want to work on retaliatory violence. We want to talk to see what we can learn about how some professionals in the conflict resolution field might be able to help law enforcement do this, since retaliatory violence seems to be a tough nut to crack. And they found two police departments that said, yeah, come on, let's see we can do here. So there was a welcome all the way along, and they were two departments that were concerned about that issue and open to working with us. I don't think we could have just knocked on the door and said, "Hey, we got something that you need." It really took an invitation.
So if other communities hear about this, and I'd like to ask you in a minute for more specifics about what, some of those specific examples that you mentioned, but if other communities hear about this, maybe they're already in a dialogue with police trying to do some police reform, is there a way they could invite you or something like this to come to do this type of training for their local police department?
Yeah, absolutely. There are two ways. They can get in touch with us directly, and you can go to our website, insightconflictresolution.org, and contact. And we're also a program of the Bureau of Justice Assistance's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. So police departments can go through BJA and request insight policing training, and then we can put together a package to deliver that.
So I think the real convincing part of this is hearing some of the examples that the officers gave you when you were doing the kind of follow-up surveys with them to say, did you put this into practice and what happened? Could you share some of those with us?
Some of the stories of the officers?
Right, some of the actual concrete examples of what you heard from them when they said, I was out on patrol, this happened, I applied these insight conflict resolution skills, and I was surprised because this happened instead of what I was expecting.
Sure. Well, there were two sorts of stories that we heard, and Megan did most of the follow-up research, so I'll let her speak about that. But one of them was on the ways that the insight policing training helped officers to solve and prevent further retaliatory violence. And there's one example that we talk about in the article, which took place in Memphis, and there was a drive-by shooting, and somebody was hit, and officers came up on the scene, and ordinarily their experience would be that nobody would talk to them, that they'd be stonewalled, and that they would sort of accept that as this is the way it's going to go down, and then they would, probably on suspicion of gang activity, they would under normal circumstances arrested the youth that they found there, hoping to get them out of harm's way, but also hoping to leverage taking them downtown or as a way to get them to talk. But instead, they started asking them questions about, well, the conflict side of things, the aggressive behavior, or which was, I don't want to talk to you. And they began to talk to them about that. And once they found out what was at stake for the youth who were there, and they began to open up a dialogue that led to information that enabled them to solve the problem. And that happened more than once. It sounds simple, but it isn't. And the other thing, though, is just in the routine duties, police officers handling situations, car stops, and restaurant deliveries differently. And Megan knows those stories better than me.
And there's one that always amazed me. So serving warrants is particularly dangerous work for police officers, and because they're trying to find somebody and they're trying to take them to jail. So there was one example in Memphis where two or three officers who were trained in insight policing went to serve a warrant to a man, and they knocked on the door. He opened it, and he was just belligerent. He said, he wanted them to go away. He was yelling. He was just thrashing around, not wanting to go. And ordinarily, the police officers would use their force, their power to subdue the man and take him, because obviously this guy was resisting because he didn't want to go to jail. But instead of jumping to that conclusion, the officers worked together to recognize that, wait a second, he's really mad. There's a reason that he's mad. Let's figure out if we can get the answer to that from from him and then use our force if necessary. So, you know, they asked him, they said, you're really mad. I mean, what are you angry about? You know, what's going on here? Why are you kind of acting like this? And, you know, with a number of insight questions, they discovered that he wasn't mad because they were there to take him. He'd been arrested before. He kind of knew the process. He was mad because he was supposed to call his wife, and he was worried about what his wife would think if he didn't call her at this specific time. So, I mean, it was this very personal threat, this reason that he did not want to go with the police right then. And so the officers let him call his wife, and the man went with him completely willingly. And the officers who told us the story were just amazed that it worked that way, that they didn't have to pull the guy kicking and screaming, but all it took was a couple of questions to discover what his behavior was all about. There are lots of stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are more stories in your article. It's here at this website on the Clearinghouse community. And I should note for our viewers that after this hangout, anyone who registered will get an email, and you'll get a link to Jamie and Megan's article, and also a link to this recording if you want to share it with someone who could not watch it live. It sounds like, so we've been talking about how you've been able to have police departments accept this idea and see that there is some merit to it. I'm going to get back to Pat's question now from St. Louis. And Pat's question is more about how you change the mind of the general public that police officers should try to de-escalate situations instead of just, you know, trying to rush in and say, this is a threat, let's eliminate the threat, let's take care of business and wrap it up. And Pat notes a situation in St. Louis where someone was killed. Non-activists there said, you know, well, you came at the cops, he must, you know, he wanted to die, he got what he wanted. How do you change that attitude that, you know, that's not how police should respond to a conflict? It's kind of a big question. I don't know if that's part of your research.
The attitude of the community who believe that officers should react quickly with force.
Right, that's the question. How do we go about changing that? Because some people say that's what police do. That's their job. It's a threat. There's a conflict. They round them up. That's it. How do you change that attitude beyond just the attitude of the police department to the broader public?
Well, I think by experiencing it in a different way. I mean, the last year has really brought to the fore that kind of reactivity with force is, you know, has led to a lot of things that we would have preferred to not happen. I mean, lots of police deaths or deaths at the hands of police and that kind of thing. And and that just continues to erode the legitimacy of officers. And we really, really need to have a strong, legitimate force in order to, you know, have effective policing. So I guess my answer would be experience, and it's not that they shouldn't use force ever. It's that using insight policing skills will help them determine when force is the best response, you know, or when maybe they got it wrong. Maybe somebody is reaching for their phone, you know, not for a dangerous weapon. So I think insight policing helps officers make the most targeted and precise decisions that they can given a context, because they have more information about what's actually driving a person's behavior.
Yeah, it does. It seems like the question is really, how do we get stories like the ones you're telling where situations had a different outcome and one that I think most reasonable people would prefer? How do we get those stories in front of the public? Because I think you're right, that is what would change, you know, hearts and minds, as we say. I'd like to kind of stay on the bigger picture topic for a minute. You know, so we're talking about the past year. This has been a more, as I was saying, you know, a mainstream issue that people are thinking about. We've seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, lots more news coverage on police-civilian interactions. The Justice Department is investigating these types of things. The investigation they had in Ferguson, as an example. Is insight policing the answer to all of this?
No.
No, I mean, insight policing is part of the answer, I think. And Pat's question, the larger question, goes to what a complex set of issues it is. I mean, we need to recognize that law enforcement techniques, or the enforcement of the law, isn't the only way to deal with the issues that we're facing. And we need a better understanding, both for our communities and our police officers and our politicians and our policymakers, of what conflict is, about what happens when we feel threatened, and how it can be transformed, not through coercive force, not through the use of a counter use of threat or bigger threat, but by doesn't work all the time, but it works more than threat does, to say, hey, what's going on with you? It takes a skilled person to do that, and it may sound simplistic, but when I say this, but when you ask a person when you notice that somebody is feeling threatened, or they're viewing a situation with a sense of dis-ease, and you say, what's going on? What's the problem with this? What are you worried is going to happen? What's your felt sense of self here? What's the social issue that's at stake for you? Not only does it slow things down, but it makes people aware of the fact that they're using their minds to come to this position. And we're conscious beings, and we intrinsically want to be critical rather than hasty. We intrinsically want to be mindful rather than reactive. We intrinsically want to be conscientious rather than rash. And the problem with operating under threat is that we are so certain, and we're so righteous, and we do things in ways that are almost automatic, and they can be violent responses that we wish we could take back. So many stories that we heard from police officers after shootings were to have they have the shooter in their car, and you would think, in the back seat of the car, and you'd think that this is a big, tough guy who's just used a gun to. And he said many times there are just tears rolling down their face because they realize, oh my God, what have I done on any number of levels? And the insight approach helps people to catch that before it gets too far. And these things can be, Sargent Shriver is a good example. These sorts of approaches can be built into policies. They can be built into programs. They can be built into policing. They can be built into leadership. And I think that's the larger conversation that needs to happen. So insight policing is an example, but it's only one targeted example of a larger set of conversations we need to have.
I'm glad you brought up Sargent Shriver. It's our primary audience is usually legal services attorneys or people involved in advocacy on behalf of or representation of people living in poverty. And what we're talking about here is not necessarily what we usually talk about, which is here's how to better represent your client. Here's a strategy you can use. But I do think it's interesting in a couple ways that attorneys do interviews all the time with people who are in situations, they're not about to be arrested or something, but are in a situation where they may be feeling a threat. So it's kind of interesting to me to think about applying these same principles in a legal practice really, which isn't really why we wanted to publish your article, but it's just sort of just now occurring to me. But one thing I do want to talk to you about briefly, where our time is drawing to an end. In your article, you couch this entire idea in you base it in the thinking and the practice of Sargent Shriver. Many of us in the legal aid world think of Sargent Shriver as the architect of our legal aid programs. How do you see those two pieces of Sargent Shriver tying together? Something that seems so disparate on its face as how police work, and then representation of free legal services for low-income people.
Well, the quotations from Sarge's speeches that we offered at the beginning of that article, and that linked into the insight policing, were delivered to the legal community, and they were done. They were speeches that were delivered about 50 years ago when Sarge was running the Office of Economic Opportunity and the War on Poverty, and developed legal services as a response to that. He was really concerned about what he called the crisis in the rule of law, which is that group of Americans who think that the law is illegitimate, that the law isn't on their side, that they have nothing to do with it, and so they're better off taking the law to their own hands. And his concern in that regard was with people living in poverty, obviously, and his diagnosis, and he was right, and he's right, was that one of the reasons that there's a crisis in the rule of law is that people living in poverty were not represented. They didn't have a fair shake, and many of the laws were skewed against them. So he started legal services as what he called the National Law Office for the poor. And they did. I mean, he was most proud of legal services of all the things he did. I see our work with police officers as an extension of that. Not only are the major difficulties, do they tend to be in lower income or economically distressed communities where police legitimacy tends to be lower. Certainly the problem of retaliatory crime, when we started working, the incidence of it is higher among people living in poverty than not. And the issue of the crisis in the rule of law, while I think there are still issues with legal representation and legal services, generated its own threat in the powers that be and curtailed it over time, as anybody in legal services knows. But by going to the police officers seemed to me to be the next step in ameliorating that crisis. So what Sarge talked about was the need not just to get people legal representation, but to change their whole experience of the law, to experience it as fair, to experience it as just, and not as stacked against them. And if you can come into your into your expectations of your relationships with police officers as them being negative or ready to put their hand on their gun or use force against you, there's a wariness, there's a conflict that's built in that needs to be transformed. And so, to me, there's a direct line. It doesn't seem disparate at all between what Sarge was trying to do when he, in fact, created the field of poverty law and what we're trying to do with those in the law enforcement community to help them strengthen their efforts at community.
If I could, I don't know, we're over our time now, but we have a couple of really good questions that have come in from Ariel, and I'd just like to pick one of them, just aware that we are over our time, but I do want to ask this. She says she sees some comparisons here to community policing. She's widely regarded by activists as failing. But it started with similar ideas. You want to increase legitimacy, help officers understand communities where they're serving, how to learn to deal with people, and not immediately with force. So she wanted to know what the differences are and how do we keep from insight policing from kind of going down the same path?
I could answer that one too. Well, insight policing is rooted in community policing principles, absolutely. The difference is that many community policing programs separate. So they try to humanize officers to community members and community members to officers through programs that are out kind of off hours. So basketball games and community cookouts and trust building encounters that are supposed to translate to the moment of enforcement. So if I make a buddy on the basketball court, then if I see the officer, then I'm not going to be I'm gonna imagine that he's legitimate or she's legitimate. But the problem, and one of our it's interesting, one of our officers talked about this. One of the officers that we interviewed said, this is the tricky part. How do you maintain trust with the community members you've built trust with while enforcing the law? Because really you're using your power to subdue a community member. So what insight policing does, and how it's a little bit different from many community policing programs, is that it gives officers the skills kind of in the moment to engage with community members on their own terms. And so when situations are becoming volatile, they employ their skills to recognize conflict, to disengage it, and it's a really in the moment of enforcement kind of method and technique. So rather than being outside, it's really while officers are policing.
Thank you, and thanks for that great question, Ariel. We are at the end of our time. So I want to remind everyone that you will receive an email, I think probably on Friday. It will include a link to Jamie and Megan's article on Insight Policing. I encourage you to read that if you found what they say today is interesting. It's almost just a tease of what's in the real article. You'll also get a link to this recording. I want to invite you to join me next month for our hangout in September. I'll be having a conversation with Stephanie Becker. She's a senior policy specialist at the Shriver Center, and she manages something called Help Hub, which is this really innovative online community to help implement the Affordable Care Act in Illinois. And it's a neat model that can be applied in other contexts and in other states. That will be on Wednesday, September 23rd, same time as today, 1 o'clock Eastern, noon Central Time. Also in that email you'll get, there will be a link to register for that, so I hope you'll join me again next week. I want to thank my guests again today. Jamie, thanks very much.
My pleasure. It's great. Thanks again.
And Megan, thank you very much for your work and for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right, and thanks to all of you for joining, and I hope I'll see you again next month. Bye-bye.